Now I'd like to introduce Jan Peach, who is today's featured speaker. Dr. Peach's professional and academic work focuses on early-stage technology assessment and strategic decision support for investors, manufacturers, and research institutions. A primary emphasis is on evaluating the value proposition of new technologies and providing quantitative input into the selection of promising technology concepts and their targeted development. This includes model-based assessment of the clinical and health economic benefit from new diagnostics and therapies. He received his academic training at the University of Karlsruhe in Germany and also here at Stanford University, where he completed his PhD. Dr. Peach is co-founder, president, and CEO of MedTech Inc. That's a technology consulting firm focused on health economic and value assessment. Previously, he's been a research fellow with the US FDA's Office of Device Evaluation. Currently, he holds an appointment as adjunct professor of management science and engineering at Stanford, where he also serves as a director at the Stanford Biocenter for Biodesign. The center is located here on campus, next to the medical school and in the center of Silicon Valley, which seems fitting, and it's a leading program in medical technology innovation. Its vision is for a world where health technology innovators from around the globe have immersive, collaborative, cutting-edge training that they require to thrive. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Jan.
Thank you very much, Masha. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see many of you registered here, and it's also nice to see the interest in medical technology, because it's really, I think, one of the fields where you can combine different interdisciplinary competencies and expertise and really do something very meaningful by bringing technologies to patients that really improve outcomes and that also help to manage care, and provide services in an appropriate manner, which is increasingly, as we see, important in healthcare systems around the globe. We have two topics today that I'd like to discuss with you. One is regulation of medical devices, and the second is health economic value assessment. They are really critical for the successful bench-to-bedside innovation process of medical technology, and so we'd like to highlight those in this webinar. There's also a class we will mention later that I'm teaching in the spring quarter for those of you interested in taking the course online. To set the stage, let's look at a couple of medical technologies. Starting from top left here, you see a transcatheter aortic heart valve, or TAVR, which is a new way to place an artificial heart valve. It replaces the surgical open chest approach and is one of the key cardiovascular innovations of the last couple of years. It really facilitated treatment of patients that were previously not candidates for surgery and needed to be medically managed only. And also it's a candidate, or it's a technology that replaces over time surgery. So very high patient value device, and we'll get back to that later in a case study. You see on the right, next to it, deep brain stimulation, which is also an exciting neurostimulation technology that is used for treatment of epilepsy, for example, for treatment of depression, but also for treatment of Parkinson's disease. So a big patient impact, and also one of the medical devices that contributes to reduction in the need for medication usage. So you see a direct link actually for medical technology also can replace pharmaceutical treatment regimens. Next to it you see an advanced stent therapy for cardiovascular applications. You see an imaging device for mammography or breast cancer screening, which also is a very important field. I mean, all of imaging and diagnostics. You see just next to it, further below, a treatment for obstructive sleep apnea, which is a big health concern. I mean, obstructive sleep apnea is a condition because it really elevates long-term cardiovascular and stroke risk. And in patients who don't tolerate CPAP treatment, which is a mask-based treatment, to treat sleep apnea, a new device has been developed that again uses neurostimulation technology to stimulate the tongue base at night and thereby keep the airway open. Then you see a diagnostic device for glucose monitoring, which is you can see over the counter or can purchase in any pharmacy in the United States. Certainly has a large need or large number of users, but there are continuous advancements also with the connection to mobile health technologies that really facilitate better management of the condition of diabetes. Then next to it to the left, you see a new approach to actually diagnose lung cancer and to avoid invasive procedures. It's a genomic marker test. You see here a bronchoscopy being performed and a brush that is used to take a sample which is then analyzed in a lab to determine the risk or the likelihood that the patient actually does have a cancerous condition or a lesion. And by using such new technology, there is the opportunity to reduce invasive surgical biopsy, and you can imagine that that's really a risk reduction for the patient, and it's a benefit also to the healthcare system in terms of avoiding costs of complex procedures. Then a device that is, or family of devices, artificial joints. You see the hip joint here, or the knee joint. Roughly 700,000 total knee replacements are performed per year in the United States alone, and so again, big impact on patient quality of life in patients with severe arthritis, but also a big market for medical technology, or orthopedic technologies. And then finally, technologies such as high-flow therapy, respiratory support systems that are gradually replacing more invasive respiratory support modalities such as intubation or otherwise mask-based treatments. Again, I think all of these technologies, and there are many, many more, show you the wide variety of technologies and the wide variety of opportunities to really improve patient care and patient outcomes. Now, for all of these technologies, if we are thinking of innovations in those spaces, right, we need to think about demonstrating the value of these technologies to the patients, or at least developing an understanding, right, how meaningful a technology is to patients. We also need to think about the questions of safety and effectiveness of these technologies. And the leading question there, or lead question really is, what constitutes safety of a medical technology? What does it take to demonstrate safety and effectiveness? Next, we need to worry or think about, the target population. Is this a very narrow, defined population that could benefit from the therapy or the technology, or is it a larger target population? Thinking of the knee replacement, 700,000 per year number of devices, that's very different to some other technology areas. So we need to appreciate and define the target population, because it also has an effect on the safety profile and on the effectiveness profile, and we'll discuss that in a minute. And then finally, is this technology of value, right? Should it be paid for? And if so, what amount would be appropriate for healthcare systems? And we also need to keep in mind that this value question really is stakeholder specific and it's country specific. So a technology that might be of value in the United States healthcare system might not be of value in other healthcare systems like the UK, France, Spain, or Japan. And the reason is that we not only might have some slight variations in the underlying clinical profile, but we have very different implementations of healthcare systems and also different cost structures and cost profiles. And so you see that all of these questions really directly relate to the fields of regulation and health economics that we discussed today. And a point that we should mention also specifically here is that, very different from other industries like the automotive industry or many consumer electronics fields, commercial success and bringing a therapy really to the patient for commercial use means that we need to rely on approval by regulatory authorities. In the United States, it's the Food and Drug Administration, and we also need to obtain reasonable positive reimbursement that actually allows us to have a viable business in the end. So without those third-party considerations or approval by third parties, there's no way to have a successful translation from development or R&D to the clinical use and the patient benefit. So that means we need to understand very thoroughly the requirements of regulatory approval and of reimbursement approval and value assessment. And there's a direct link, as you probably appreciate, between the requirements and the commercialization risks and rewards. Also time to market. Imagine, for example, a required 2-year follow-up study as opposed to 6-month follow-up. That very much affects your time to market, and it also affects the costs of development and clinical testing. And that leads us directly also to the funding requirements. When you think of raising funds for a new concept or new technology, the questions of, or the aspects of regulation and reimbursement really drive heavily the funding requirement question as well. And there's increasing importance globally to demonstrate value in a changing healthcare environment. So let's talk about regulation. A couple of years ago, we did a study at Stanford Biodesign where we outlined the medical development process from the very early stage of needs identification all the way through post-market. And you see key activities listed here. You see also decision gates along the way. And what was really striking is that more than half of the activities and the decisions are governed by regulatory and reimbursement requirements, and most of them actually regulatory requirements. Second point I'd like to make here is that regulation not only relates to the approval of medical technologies or the pre-market review as it's called, but also to the full life cycle of a medical device. So all aspects of surveillance in the field, managing feedback that you receive from patients and providers about issues with the device, manufacturing, production, all of those aspects are regulated and governed by regulation. And so in order to successfully manage a business, you need to be aware of those requirements and implement procedures accordingly. Two important definitions that govern FDA's work when evaluating technology. You see the legal definitions from the Code of Federal Regulations for Safety and for Effectiveness. And let me just read them to you. There's reasonable assurance that a device is safe when it can be determined based on valid scientific evidence that the probable benefits to health from use of the device for its intended uses and conditions of use, when accompanied by adequate directions and warnings against unsafe use, outweigh the probable risks. Again, in this definition of safety, you see this balance of benefits and risks, or that the benefits need to outweigh the risks. You also see a couple of important definitions. One is the question of what constitutes valid scientific evidence. Is it a randomized controlled trial, for example, which is the highest level of evidence, or is it sufficient for some technologies to use less comprehensive data, to use, for example, a single-arm study and compare the results to previously published results from another technology? So this is a very relevant and key question, and also is actually one of the drivers in the implementation of the regulatory process. You may have heard about the regulatory pendulum and that there were differences between how administrations actually enforced regulation and implemented regulation, and one of the key drivers here is the question how much evidence is needed and what is considered to be valid or valid enough. Another definition is the intended use. You cannot get clearance for a technology for use in any patient. It's always for one specific or several specific indications for use or intended uses. And you also need to be careful in describing and specifying what is the condition of use. Is it in an inpatient setting, in an outpatient setting? Who is performing or using the device? All of those are relevant questions for the regulatory review process. Labeling is part of that as well as the instructions for use. Effectiveness, looking further below, there is reasonable assurance that a device is effective when it can be determined based upon, again, valid scientific evidence that in a significant portion of the target population, the use of the device for its intended uses and conditions of use, when accompanied by adequate directions and warnings against unsafe use, will provide clinically significant results. Again, definitions of valid scientific evidence, also definitions for intended use in a given population, and also the definition of clinically significant results. That means FDA, and that's different to, for example, the European regulatory requirements, FDA really evaluates the benefit to the patient in terms of outcomes, in terms of effectiveness. It's not sufficient to agree that a technology is safe enough, but it really needs to demonstrate a clinically significant improvement. In Europe, the focus with the CE labeling, for those interested and familiar with the European system, is to evaluate safety and performance. And performance means not the clinical performance, but that the device does what it's intended to do. But there's no long-term evaluation of outcomes as part of the regulatory process. How is regulation implemented in the United States? When Congress enacted medical device regulation in 1976, following pharmaceutical regulation which was in place since the 1930s with the Food, Drug and Cosmetics Act, Congress determined that for medical devices, and again different to pharma, it does make sense to consider the risk level of a device, because you can imagine medical devices like syringes, and you see the photo here on the right, have a much different risk profile than a intracardiac stent or catheter. And so the three risks, 1, 2, 3, are increasing in risk level, and the review requirements are different. There are exempt devices that really require only the registration of the manufacturer, but no submission of clinical or other test data. Then there's the so-called 510K process. The definition actually goes back to the Code of Federal Regulations section. It's the typical process for Class 2 devices, and it requires demonstration of substantial equivalence to one or several predicate devices. So as long as you can show that your technology performs similarly to an existing technology or uses technology components that were previously cleared through the 510K process, you can demonstrate after review by FDA, you can demonstrate, if you're successful, that the technology is substantially equivalent, and therefore should be cleared to market via the 510K process. Then there's pre-market approval, or PMA, which is the highest regulatory process, is very much comparable to the new drug application process in medical devices, always requires a trial-based evaluation, typically with several phases of clinical trials. In addition to pre-market evaluation and clearance, as I mentioned earlier, there are regulations governing manufacturing and other aspects, quality system regulation, R&D processes, manufacturing, procurement, distribution, product surveillance, and many other aspects. FDA review is actually a paper-based review. I mean, even though a lot of these papers are now electronic, but it's not that FDA evaluates a device, takes it apart, and studies its risk profile. Companies submit documentation of tests that were performed, and you see how comprehensive these dockets are. This is for a PMA type device, and what FDA receives and then needs to review within 180 days typically. And you can imagine that that's a tall order and a very comprehensive task involving biostatistics, engineering, medical disciplines, and so on, and real expert knowledge within the agency. As mentioned earlier, the implementation of the regulatory review process has changed over time. This chart comes from the latest MEDUFA report that FDA published just early this year, and it shows the pre-market approval, again the highest risk class device approvals, and you see in green the successful or approved devices and how that changed over the years. And you can see, for example, that with the beginning of the Obama administration in 2008 and 2009, the approval rates for PMAs really went down significantly, and that was a result of stricter requirements that the new administration or the new leadership at FDA implemented at that time. Since then, it has dramatically increased again, and FDA has been very successful actually in further improving its operations and procedures, which is good news to everyone involved in the industry. Now let's switch over to our second topic, health economic value assessment. To give you some background about the environment that we all or anyone operating in the field of medical devices, needs to face, you see for the United States, again, the total federal spending as percent of the gross domestic product over the years. And you can appreciate or see here in red the major health programs, that's Medicare and Medicaid primarily, being the highest spending category of government spending, roughly 5% of the GDP. And consider that this is only the government part of healthcare. When you add all of the private aspects and commercial insurance aspects of healthcare, we're currently looking at 18 or 19% of the GDP being spent on healthcare in the United States, which is roughly double what other countries in Europe spend. And it's not only in Europe, but especially in the US, it's a concern, especially when you look at the projected future expenses, which are driven, among other factors, by changes in the age groups, for example, of patients, demographic changes. And you can also appreciate that, as just occurred or was proposed, if defense spending, which you see further down, is increased by $50 billion from one year to the other at the expense of other government spending categories, that there is even more pressure on spending on healthcare, for example, right? And that means also that there is or needs to be significant scrutiny, and funds should be spent wisely on technologies or aspects of healthcare that really are meaningful, that contribute value, and that's the environment we live in and that we're increasingly facing going forward. Therefore, not only in the United States, but globally, any healthcare system, regardless of their ability to spend and the absolute amount of spending on healthcare, all healthcare systems face the issue of improving, or the desire to further improve patient outcomes, while also managing costs, controlling costs, in some cases reducing costs. And so technology really can contribute significantly to helping resolve these issues, right? We just need to make sure that the technologies we're bringing forward really address one or two of these concerns, ideally both of them, right, in outcome improvement at overall same or reduced costs. Now, when we look further at value, we need to appreciate that there are different stakeholders involved. It's not sufficient to only look at Medicare, for example, and show that Medicare expenses, even though that's very important and relevant, right? If Medicare expenses are reduced with the introduction of a new technology, it might be that it comes at increased cost or lower revenue margin for the hospitals, right? And so from a hospital perspective, from a pure financial perspective, that would mean it's not of value, to adopt a new technology. And so keeping in mind that the ultimate driver should always be an improvement in patient outcomes, but on the financial side, we need to be aware of those ramifications and be aware of different stakeholders. We need to think about demonstrating incremental improvement compared to status quo, which also means that we need to identify and very carefully appreciate how technologies are currently, or how patients treated with existing technologies, right? And we need to identify the incremental changes. We need to have a focus on cost and outcome, demonstrate the long-term perspective, and consider not only the episode of care, but also the longer-term implications in terms of costs and outcomes. So from a patient perspective, again, going back to the clinical objectives of any new technology, we need to be able to demonstrate either a mortality or a reduction in mortality survival improvement, or a reduction in patient morbidity, or a improvement in patient-related quality of life. In some technologies, actually, we're able to address all of them, but keep in mind that these are the three drivers really that drive the value proposition to a patient. And we need to be able to demonstrate a viable health economic profile. A therapy needs to be either cost-saving or cost-effective to be of value, and that is measured through the cost-effectiveness ratio. On the right-hand side, you see a graph where you see at the 0 point or the cross of the axis the existing approach and technology, how a patient might be treated in a given indication, and we're looking at the difference in costs, delta costs on the y-axis, and the difference in outcomes or effectiveness, often measured in quality-adjusted life years, to the right. And you can appreciate that there might be technologies that lead to better patient outcomes at higher overall costs and up to a certain willingness to pay threshold that is defined by individual healthcare systems. A technology might be considered to be of good value, to be cost-effective, and that means it should be adopted. There are also technologies that, hopefully in the future, more technologies that improve patient outcomes, while also reducing overall costs to the healthcare system, and that would be in the quadrant to the on the lower right. When we think of developing technologies that lead to higher costs at minimally increased effectiveness that lie above the willingness to pay threshold here, then you can appreciate that they're not considered to be of good value, and will be very hard to actually get successful adoption of those technologies in the future. So the implications continued here. We need to, again, appreciate all of the requirements in how agencies, like in the UK, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, how they evaluate technologies, and we need to collect data in a prospective way from the very early stage of development all the way through clinical, and be aware of those requirements. Let me briefly go through a case study for TAVR, transcatheter aortic valve replacement. Remember that we looked at this technology on the very first slide, and I'd like to briefly discuss with you the safety, effectiveness, and value assessment based on this real-world technology. Brief background about the medical condition, aortic valve disease. The aortic valve is actually the most important. All of the heart valves are important, but the most important valve or highest pressure valve actually between the left ventricle and the aorta and the main body artery vasculature. And in many patients, aortic stenosis in older ages leads to a narrowing of this valve. In the old days and up to now, the main treatment approach was open heart surgery, which you see on top here, which requires a very invasive procedure, open chest, and you can appreciate, what that means in terms of length of stay, in terms of quality of life impact, also mortality impact, in fact. And transcatheter aortic valve replacement is a new technology that has been introduced over the last decade to address patients that are not candidates for surgery because they're too sick, too ill, and wouldn't survive or possibly survive surgery. And increasingly, this approach is also used to replace surgeries in candidates that are at intermediate risk. And you can see on this image here on the right-hand side how the valve is actually implanted through the catheter without opening the chest of the patient. So now if we look through the regulatory or the value lens again, starting with the question of general evaluation of TAVR, we probably should compare this TAVR approach against surgical treatment in patients that are candidates for surgery. In patients previously not candidates for surgery, we need to compare against the existing paradigm for these patients, which was medical management. So again, it shows that we need to carefully appreciate and understand what's the patient population that we're looking at when evaluating the technology, and also what's the current paradigm of treatment, because that drives our incremental differences in terms of patient outcome and in terms of cost. How should we evaluate the effectiveness? Well, it's the long-term survival that really is the most meaningful factor here. So we need to appreciate not only the procedural success or maybe 6-month follow-up outcome, but ideally the remaining lifetime of the patient and how survival is affected by this new technology. We also need to think about events like strokes and heart attacks that might be affected by the use of the technology. And to assess those outcomes, ideally we would want to see 1-year or 2-year outcomes from a trial to be able to evaluate that. There are also factors like 6-minute walk test and other approaches to evaluate the functional ability of a patient. All of those factors in sum really drive effectiveness and do have an impact on the quality adjusted life year that we're measuring in health economic analyses. What cost elements do we need to consider when comparing TAVR and surgical AVR, so the mainstay treatment, open chest surgery? We need to consider, for example, the number of intensive care days that are required after one versus the other procedure. We need to consider length of stay. We need to consider certainly the cost of the valve. A transcatheter aortic heart valve actually costs around $30,000 in the United States versus maybe $6,000 for a surgical valve, and you can imagine how that factors into the cost equation and the cost difference equation. So what clinical data are needed to support cost calculations? As I mentioned earlier, on the effectiveness side, there are parameters like stroke rates and heart attack rates that might also be influenced by the use of this different technology, and certainly we want to capture those also on the cost side, as the treatment of a stroke has immediate cost implications and long-term implications. What data sources could be used to support a cost assessment, where we could do a micro-costing approach during the trial, but there's also extensive literature or publication-based data available, that discuss the cost of a stroke treatment or that discuss the cost of an ICU day, intensive care day. So there are a number of sources we can rely on when performing these health economic value assessments. Might there be differences between subgroups of patients? Absolutely. So again, it shows that we need to be aware of the specific target population that we're evaluating, not only from a regulatory perspective, but also from the health economic perspective. When you think of high-risk patients or extreme-risk patients, for example, versus intermediate-risk patients, the safety profile and the health economic profile could look very different. And you should also appreciate that when going back to the benefits outweighing the risks equation, right, or the scale here that we saw earlier, that certainly the risks in patients that are at extreme risk are much different than patients at intermediate risk, right? So keep that in mind. If you're interested in reading more about the health economic evaluation of a transcatheter aortic heart valve, there's an interesting study by Reynolds and colleagues that was published last year, and I give you the reference down here, but it shows what we just looked at, this plane of costs and effects and the likelihood that the technology actually would be cost effective when considering a threshold of $50,000 to $150,000 per quality adjusted life here in the United States. And the conclusion of that study was, even though the technology costs more from a healthcare system perspective, the improved outcomes actually lead to a very favorable health economic profile. Willingness to pay of the society, as stated in the United States, between $50,000 and $150,000, means that this should be adopted even if it's higher cost. There are also a couple of interesting regulatory documents. The pre-market approval PMA summary of the transcatheter aortic heart valve device is available under this link at the agency, and you find all of the documentation of the clinical studies and preclinical studies that were performed, so it's very educational. Similarly, as I mentioned, the cost effectiveness article. So to briefly summarize, without regulatory approval, there's no market access. The key criteria for approval in the United States are safety and effectiveness. We need to determine early on how the product will be regulated, because that drives the regulatory requirements. We also need to appreciate the detailed requirements with regard to clinical testing and so on for each of the FDA pathways. And FDA online resources are available, again, if you want to study further. We can also learn from published documents of prior approvals and panel meetings that are published on the FDA website, a trove of evidence and information that really is very helpful. And as discussed, intended population, appropriate comparators, critical endpoints can be gleaned from those publications. Cures are good laboratory practices and good manufacturing practices, as discussed, are additional important elements of regulation. On the health economic side, we have seen that health economic evaluation increasingly is a critical requirement. Any healthcare system that wants to make meaningful decisions about the adoption of devices and their reimbursement price need to evaluate the healthcare benefit and the patient benefit and the cost of the technology. And that means for us, from an innovator perspective, that we need to be aware of those requirements. We need to actually collect information during the trial and during development already, collecting evidence that we can use to demonstrate the value proposition. We also need to appreciate what are the key value drivers of a new therapy very early on in development. And we need to appreciate that it's not only the episode of care or episode of implantation, but the long-term implications and effects of the therapy that we need to consider. Value is defined by incremental changes from current status quo. So we need to appreciate what are the current therapies, what are the outcomes and the costs. And again, we have differences between individual countries. Useful resources for health economics are HTAs, or health technology assessment reports that are published and publicly available, as well as cost-effectiveness studies in the published literature. So with that, I'd like to briefly say few sentences about 256, which starting this year actually is listed or cross-listed also as a bioengineering course, BioE 256, Tech Assessment and Regulation of Medical Devices. It's a course that is given Fridays, 1:30 to 3:20, 9 sessions total available through SCVD. Lectures include guest speakers from industry and the FDA, and also a hands-on team-based class project investigating a real-world medical technology, both from the regulatory perspective, but also from the health economic value perspective. And you can find details on the class website, which is given here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was a great presentation. And now I'd like to hand back over to Jan so he can answer some of the questions that you've been sending through.
Thank you, Marsha. We did, thanks for all of your questions. We did receive a couple of them that are listed here, and let me just go through them step by step. One of you asked about the design thinking process or concepts and how they have been used and applied in the medical technology field. And some of you that are not familiar with design thinking, it's a process that was defined at Stanford and at IDEO, evaluating or using concepts of needs identification by observation, and those concepts have been implemented, namely in the biodesign process taught at the Biodesign Center that Marsha mentioned earlier, where a fellowship is offered that emphasizes heavily the early phase of the process of medical technology innovation, where we try to have the fellows spend time in the actual clinical setting and observe processes to identify needs, and then in a very careful manner and process narrow the needs down into the most important needs that then lead to the next step, which is actually innovation or inventing technologies and then filtering concepts down to one final product or product idea. So the design thinking process really is, we think, very applicable to medical technology and has been used for 15 years in the biodesign program very efficiently and effectively. But how do you prove, next question, how do you prove value on something like preventative medicine? Very good question, and indeed there are important programs that are supported by technology also, where you try to avoid or improve the long-term patient outcome. You can think, for example, of weight management in obesity. You can think of cardiac risk factors. If you manage them effectively, you can influence the long-term outcome, and the benefits of these technologies are evaluated prospectively, and sometimes in model-based assessment. So you try to appreciate how behavior and certain parameters like blood pressure or weight are affected with the use of such preventative program, and then you can project the likely long-term impact and evaluate whether it would be meaningful both in terms of patient outcome but also in terms of cost. So very good question, and there are many technologies actually that focus on the preventative field. There's one question about transcatheter aortic valve replacement. Here I mentioned the roughly $30,000 cost that is published in publications in the United States. And the question is, what is the price elsewhere? There are some variations, and again, just going by public domain information in European countries, the valve, according to publications, is in the range of 20,000 euros. Again, variation within those countries, but yes, there are global differences, but we need to also keep in mind that healthcare in general and healthcare system costs are very different in these other markets. And certainly pricing of technologies impacts the value proposition of a technology. So these are all very intertwined aspects. Let me just look at the next questions here. How will the changes in development of medical device regulation in Europe and in Asia affect the development of innovative medical devices? For a long time, Europe was seen as, from a regulatory perspective, more innovation friendly, and that still is the case, but there are some changes in regulation on the way, currently need to be approved by the European Parliament still to be implemented, but especially for high-risk devices, the requirements are now supposed to be a little bit more stringent and closer to the PMA evaluation in the United States. In Asia, there are changes. In Japan, there were significant issues with the review process in that it took a very long time, and you can imagine that very long review time means also delayed patient access, and the Japanese healthcare authorities have worked hard in improving more rapid reviews while maintaining high levels of safety and effectiveness. But certainly those factors of global regulatory systems also influence companies' strategic decision-making about initial markets to access and gain clinical experiences with and commercialize. And then I think there's one more question here about software regulations. Could I talk a little bit more about software regulations? Certainly, when you look at the technologies we've evaluated or looked at early on, deep brain stimulation, heavily driven by software, right? When you think of an ECG machine or even this mammography device that we looked at, software plays a big role, and FDA has guidelines for software regulation and for software testing and for failure modes and effect analysis. So they are a key cornerstone of the review process. Certainly not an easy one, and I think there are continued efforts to study better or develop better approaches to evaluate software and determine, how much evaluation and testing do you need to do of software to make sure that it's reliable enough. Something that is not only limited to the healthcare industry, but also to other industries like automotive and aerospace, where you face the same issues of software reliability.
I'll jump in with one which came in a little bit later, but for startup companies, is it critical to consult with the FDA ahead of time to prepare for approval? If so, how to establish the connection? Perhaps with your Biodesign Center links, you might have some experience of that.
So it is always a good idea to first use the published resources, and I mentioned the FDA website with a lot of useful information. So once you've done as a company the homework and evaluated as good as you can the available resources, I think it's always a good idea to reach out to the agency and have an early dialogue. But you increase the likelihood of successful outcome if you've done your homework internally beforehand. There's also a center at the FDA that's called DICE, Division for Industry and Consumer Education, which has a hotline and provides free advice to companies. And so I think a first step in terms of FDA interaction, aside from the typical regulatory review branch contacts and division contacts, is to make use of that free advice through that center. Again, it's DICE at the agency, and they provide webinars and also a telephone hotline. And that might be a good first segue, especially for small companies who experience this process for the first time.
Great. Well, thank you again for the talk, Jan, and also being able to give really helpful, detailed answers to those questions. Thank you everyone who sent them in. I'm afraid we didn't have a chance to get through all of them because of time, but hopefully you found a lot that's useful to take away from that, and enjoy the rest of your day. Now I'd like to introduce Jan Peach, who is today's featured speaker. Dr. Peach's professional and academic work focuses on early-stage technology assessment and strategic decision support for investors, manufacturers, and research institutions. A primary emphasis is on evaluating the value proposition of new technologies and providing quantitative input into the selection of promising technology concepts and their targeted development. This includes model-based assessment of the clinical and health economic benefit from new diagnostics and therapies. He received his academic training at the University of Karlsruhe in Germany and also here at Stanford University, where he completed his PhD. Dr. Peach is co-founder, president, and CEO of MedTech, Inc. That's a technology consulting firm focused on health economic and value assessment. Previously, he's been a research fellow with the US FDA's Office of Device Evaluation. Currently, he holds an appointment as adjunct professor of management science and engineering at Stanford, where he also serves as a director at the Stanford Center for Biodesign. The center is located here on campus, next to the medical school and in the center of Silicon Valley, which seems fitting, and it's a leading program in medical technology innovation. Its vision is for a world where health technology innovators from around the globe have immersive, collaborative, cutting-edge training that they require to thrive. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to...
Which is, you can see over the counter or can purchase in any pharmacy in the United States, certainly has a large need or large number of users, but there are continuous advancements also with the connection to mobile health technologies that really facilitate better management of the condition of diabetes. Then next to it to the left, you see a new approach to actually diagnose lung cancer and to avoid invasive procedures. It's a genomic marker test. You see here a bronchoscopy being performed and a brush that is used to take a sample which is then analyzed in a lab to determine the risk or the likelihood that the patient actually does have a cancerous condition or a lesion. And by using such new technology, there is the opportunity to reduce invasive surgical biopsy, and you can imagine that that's really a risk reduction for the patient, and it's a benefit also to the healthcare system in terms of avoiding costs of complex procedures. Then a device that is, or family of devices, artificial joints. You see the hip joint here, or the knee joint. Roughly 700,000 total knee replacements are performed per year in the United States alone, and so again, big impact on patient quality of life in patients with severe arthritis, but also a big market for medical technology, or orthopedic technologies. And then finally, technologies such as high flow.
Jan.
Thank you very much, Marsha. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see many of you registered here, and it's also nice to see the interest in medical technology, because it's really, I think, one of the fields where you can combine different interdisciplinary competencies and expertise and really do something very meaningful by bringing technologies to patients that really improve outcomes and that also help to manage care, and provide services in an appropriate manner, which is increasingly, as we see, important in healthcare systems around the globe. We have two topics today that I'd like to discuss with you. One is regulation of medical devices, and the second is health economic value assessment. They are really critical for the successful bench-to-bedside innovation process of medical technology, and so we'd like to highlight those in this webinar. There's also a class we will mention later that I'm teaching in the spring quarter for those of you interested in taking the course online. To set the stage, let's look at a couple of medical technologies. Starting from top left here, you see a transcatheter aortic heart valve, or TAVR, which is a new way to place an artificial heart valve. It replaces the surgical open chest approach and is one of the key cardiovascular innovations of the last couple of years. It really facilitated treatment of patients that were previously not candidates for surgery and needed to be medically managed only. And also it's a candidate, or it's a technology that replaces over time surgery. So very high patient value device, and we'll get back to that later in a case study. You see on the right, next to it, deep brain stimulation, which is also an exciting neurostimulation technology that is used for treatment of epilepsy, for example, for treatment of depression, but also for treatment of Parkinson's disease. So a big patient impact, and also one of the medical devices that contributes to reduction in the need for medication usage. So you see a direct link actually for medical technology also can replace pharmaceutical treatment regimens. Next to it you see an advanced stent therapy for cardiovascular applications. You see an imaging device for mammography or breast cancer screening, which also is a very important field. I mean, all of imaging and diagnostics. You see just next to it, further below, a treatment for obstructive sleep apnea, which is a big health concern. I mean, obstructive sleep apnea is a condition because it really elevates long-term cardiovascular and stroke risk. And in patients who don't tolerate CPAP treatment, which is a mask-based treatment, to treat sleep apnea, a new device has been developed that again uses neurostimulation technology to stimulate the tongue base at night and thereby keep the airway open. Then you see a diagnostic device for glucose monitoring, therapy, respiratory support systems that are gradually replacing more invasive respiratory support modalities such as intubation or otherwise mask-based treatments. Again, I think all of these technologies, and there are many, many more, show you the wide variety of technologies and the wide variety of opportunities to really improve patient care and patient outcomes. Now, for all of these technologies, if we are thinking of innovations in those spaces, right, we need to think about demonstrating the value of these technologies to the patients, or at least developing an understanding, right, how meaningful a technology is to patients. We also need to think about the questions of safety and effectiveness of these technologies. And the leading question there, or lead question really is, what constitutes safety of a medical technology? What does it take to demonstrate safety and effectiveness? Next, we need to worry or think about, the target population. Is this a very narrow, defined population that could benefit from the therapy or the technology, or is it a larger target population, thinking of the knee replacement, 700,000 per year number of devices, that's very different to some other technology areas. So we need to appreciate and define the target population, because it also has an effect on the safety profile and on the effectiveness profile, and we'll discuss that in a minute. And then finally, is this technology